sure you guys aren't very aware about what Platypus is, but we are a project of self-criticism, education, and reconstitution of the socialist left as it appears in historical ruin. Our task is critique and education towards its reconstitution, and we see this tradition as a whole as defeated and largely self-inflicted. That's kind of our position on history. We have reading groups every Monday about the history of Marxism. We do panels like this, and then we hold coffee breaks. So we do this on campuses internationally. Okay, I'm going to introduce the panel members here. So first off, no introduction, we got Professor Brennan from the Econ department here at FNM, and we have Zarif, an activist at PSL in Lancaster, Party for Socialism and Liberation. And we have Danny Jacobs here, who is a member of Platypus Affiliated Society, and he helps out with reading groups and all that. And great, so we're going to get started with 10 to 12 minutes of opening remarks on a series of questions. Great, okay. Do you want to start off, Professor Brennan?
No.
Remarks? No? Okay.
You guys go first.
All right.
As I prepare my remarks.
Dan, you want
I can go first.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll pick
Okay.
you guys. Is this on? If this is on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. It's very loud.
Okay. Oh, I'm very loud.
No, it's loud. Don't worry. You're good.
Okay. All right. 10 years ago, Donald Trump came down on his golden escalator to Neil Young's Keep on Rocking in the Free World. Bernie Sanders had already announced in May of that year and Hillary Clinton in April for their presidential campaign. Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter were in recent memory. Marxism had been back on the table already for about a decade. The anti-Iraq war movement had already raised the specter of Marxism through some kind of form of anti-imperialism, but it was really with the 2008 crisis that Marxism returned. David Harvey's YouTube lectures on capital became popular, and so this was Marxism's a kind of heterodox explanation of the financial crisis. Mainstream commentators such as Paul Krugman had asked if Barack Obama could be Franklin Delano Obama, and the left, for example, John Bellamy Foster of the Monthly Review, wrote that, quote, "The possibility of a New Deal is to be welcomed by all those on the left." Progressives had hoped that Obama would respond to the 2008 crisis by passing landmark legislation such as universal health care. But this disappointment drove people into the streets. Consequently, Marxism then took on the form of being the extreme left of a demand for the New Deal. The idea was that this would advance the class struggle akin to the labor upsurges of the 1930s. For example, Chris Maizano, writing for Jacobin, made the case for a politics of full employment, as he put it. So this is following Polish Marxist Michael Kalecki, that this would shift the balance of power between workers and capital and lay the groundwork for more radical and permanent changes in the basic structure of the political economy. Occupy was a protest against Obama, but the left's attachment to the Democratic Party made the left unable to make the break with them. Like the 30s, the left again liquidated into the Democratic Party. Before Sanders and Trump announced their presidency, Europe had already run through a cycle of neo-social democratic movements. Syriza and Podemos came to power with the mandate of rejecting the crushing austerity of the Troika, fighting fascists like Golden Dawn, or having Marxists like Yanis Varoufakis at their head. This all ended with the parties carrying forward the austerity under the slogans of popular self-determination. They had replaced the older social democratic parties in Greece in order to carry out the same reconciliation with capital. All of this made the weight of the absence of an international party for socialism felt again. This was bound up with a kind of return to Karl Kautsky, the Pope of Marxism, and the sense of the need for mass socialist parties in order to make good on the opportunity. Furthermore, the older sectarian groups had participated in, but had not really led Occupy. They were kind of sidelined by a kind of anarchism and horizontalism of like a David Graeber. Sanders then should have been no surprise, but neither Trump. Both had supported Occupy. In fact, Donald Trump went beyond Sanders. He recognized occupying the Tea Party as the same correct discontent, and he was willing to run against his own party. He was willing to be political, to take the gamble. But in 2012, the left had to stop the then so-called white supremacist Mitt Romney. Trump did not become the focus of the left until he started winning primaries in 2015. At first, he was just called a right-wing populist. After all, it was Ted Cruz that was considered worst. He was called a constitutional fascist. And the left was even willing to ironically agree with Trump's statement that the bankers are killers and that the system is rigged. What confused the left was that they seemed to grow precisely when they liquidated into the Democratic Party. It was not Sanders that gave the Democratic Socialists of America a bump. They received a Trump bump that was significantly larger than anything Sanders had delivered. The events of Charlottesville and the appearance of the quote-unquote alt-right galvanized the left again. Marxism became anti-fascism because the left wanted to distinguish itself from the Democrats that also called Trump a fascist. And by the way, Mitt Romney also called Trump a fascist at the time of Charlottesville. At that time then, shutting down speakers on campus became leftists. After all, don't platform a fascist. These tactics have now come home, unfortunately. Really, Trump was the challenge to the aspirations of the millennial left. He took up the discontents of the war, for example. So counties where there were veterans or war weariness were the kind of greatest predictors of those that went for Trump in 2016 and again in 2020 and 2024. He railed against destruction by free trade, as we've all been experiencing in the last few weeks. He even said that the Democrats cheated Sanders. The one-sidedness of the growth of the left in the second part of the 2010s was shown by the fact that the left struggled with the feeling that they were repeating problems from the earlier history of the left. Phrases like, quote, the professional managerial class and microsect were pulled out of the new left to explain the seeming puzzle of the DSA. With the outbreak of COVID-19, the left, who have historically been skeptical of multinational pharmaceutical companies, all of a sudden became their strongest soldiers. They appealed to the bourgeois myth of the neutrality of science. Why? Trump's hesitancy to acknowledge the coronavirus, which should be clear because he had just made a deal with China at the time in January 2020, seemed to be what drove the Democrats in a kind of campaign against Trump's hesitancy to lock down. So they put Joe Biden in the basement, and then the campaign was just to run on every blunder of Trump in 2020. And so fascism was defeated at the ballot box in 2020. But with this came the doldrums of the left. Bhaskar Sankara, a key figure of millennial Marxism, wrote at the time that the left was in purgatory. Millennial Marxists who had begun the decade protesting Joe Biden, all of a sudden brought Joe Biden to the White House. Now, the first part of the platypus slogan, there's two parts. The first part, the left is dead, was received at that time, this is about 5 years ago, by the left. But they forgot the second part of the slogan, long live the left. Benedict Cryptofash, this is a pseudonym, reached for Marxism at the time in 2020, 2021 as a critique of leftism. He called for anti-leftist Marxism. Soon Zoomers, so that's the generation kind of born after 1997, the younger siblings of the millennials turned towards, quote, communism, towards, quote, Marxism-Leninism. Millennial Marxism for them had become cringe since the infamous DSA video about no clapping. In the meantime, the relationship between the US, Europe, Russia, and China had grown tenuous again. The, quote, West versus East framing gave the left fever dreams of a new Bandung conference. The, quote, East wind will overtake the West wind. The reaction to disappointment with the Democratic Party and its sisters in Europe was expressed in a new interest in communism as opposed to the socialism of the millennials. The left had spent the 20th century seesawing from anti-fascism to anti-imperialism and back again. When it is a Republican, the problem, we are told, is fascism. When it is a Democrat, the problem, we are told, is imperialism. What is usually meant by the Democrats being characterized as imperialist is that they say things that are in the realm of acceptability to the left from a taste perspective, but behave in a way that the left deplores, managing the imperialist hegemony. So the problem with Obama for the left, Libya and Syria. The problem with Biden, Israel, Palestine, and for some, Ukraine. And so again, then in 2024, Trump rode the chance of, quote, Genocide Joe back to the White House. So here we are again, and here again there will be a Marxist explanation for anti-Trump. But does Trump really necessitate Marxism? What was Marxism? Marxism developed famously as a fusion of working class politics and bourgeois radicalism. Such a fusion was not external, but rather immanently, so from within, synthetic. The proletariat, a neologism, a new term, that was used by socialists before Marx and Engels were born, was itself a contradiction, the dissolution of society, citizens without property. The class was, quote, receptive to socialism, but not because socialism was the solution. Rather, it was, as Marx put it, the riddle of history, or later Engels, insight into the nature, the conditions, and the consequent general aims of the struggle waged by the proletariat. Indeed, the proletariat was struggling with the conditions for socialism. The workers rebelled against the labor theory of value as their class oppression, but socialism could only be scientific because of how the organization of the proletariat was the means of struggling with itself. Marx and Engels were only the self-consciousness of this contradiction. The growth and success of Marxist theory gave rise to Marxism. This is after Marx's death. It was built on a treacherous basis. It had become a part of the very object it was critiquing. It became a part of capitalism. This is what Lenin meant by imperialism. Imperialism was brought about by the self-organization of the proletariat. It was their estranged activity. This is why social chauvinism was, quote, consummated opportunism for Lenin. It posed a question to the movement. Marx's famous 11th thesis was realized. The philosophers indeed had transformed the world, but the interpretation lagged. World War I posed the contradiction of the means and ends for Marxism. Marxism could have no other goal than its own self-abolition, but to achieve such required the articulation of the objective situation. A Marxist analysis of the objective situation of the war was given, but it covered the very content that Marxism was trying to bring into being. Lenin pursued the civil war in Marxism, as necessitated by Marxism itself, and he has never been forgiven for such. Either he is betrayed by his epigones, who called defeat a victory, quote-unquote socialism in one country, or he is blamed for the horrors of the 20th century. For the rest of the 20th century, or the long 20th century, since that seems to hang over today, Marxism has returned. It has remained a critique of the present, but at present it has also played a part in building. It was thus illumined. It has served as an ideological veil for the transformations of capitalism, first in the 1930s old left, then in the 1960s new left, and now again with the millennials in the 2010s. It retains descriptive validity only for the worst reason. It was betrayed. What is Marxism in the age of Trump but this continued echo? That this echo has not dissipated is because we make it sing to a familiar melody. We reproduce the old defeat in the present. But the first step to overcoming this impasse is recognizing the old tune. Okay, so those were my words.
All right, Zarif, do you want to kick us off?
Testing. All right, I just want to say I feel very underprepared, but good job.
Oh, I'll make you feel better.
Okay. So I just wanted to add with your history, Marxism has a very long history within the U.S. You know, you can, black sharecroppers were organized under Marxist-Leninism. There's a famous quote, I can't say it verbatim, but essentially one black sharecropper said, all he needs for activism is the Book of Lenin and a rifle. So the reason it didn't prosper here is because of government suppression. There's obviously the Red Scare during the Cold War, but there was another one after World War I. And so I'm from an ecology background, so I like using those kinds of analogies. I imagine it as these Red Scares as glaciers just descending across the land and just freezing everything over. That's what happened to leftism within the U.S. And the thing is, even when the glaciers recede, they scrape away all the soil. So all the collective memory from the past activists, there's a disconnect. So essentially, you're starting anew. And that has happened frequently within US history. And in fact, because of this, the way activists function, they behave in a way of an animal that has no memory. All it can do is respond to stimuli. And I think one of the goals of leftism is to create that kind of collective memory, try to fill in those gaps between activism of the present and activism of the 60s and other past activism. When it comes to Trump, people would like to tell you that it's an abnormality, it's because of Russia. It's very organic. Trump is very American. You could only come to power in America. And the ruling class will, hem and haw about how unpleasant he is, how he's not a good person, but they will utilize him. They are utilizing him. One of the things PSL talked about prior to his election was if he wins, the first thing he's going to do is try to strip away all the achievements of the working class from back in the 60s. And that's essentially what is happening. Yep, I think that's all I gotta say. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Interesting items for us to discuss when we're finished here. What I'd like to do is sort of take a little bit of a step back in sort of recent history. So if we go back to, January 11th, right, where the attack on the Capitol occurred, right? That's an amazing moment. And I don't think you really appreciate what happened there. There was a sitting president of the United States who sat by while this occurred, while people were chanting, various things, but, they wanted to, do harm to the vice president of the United States, which is, also Republican, right? And the president was perfectly happy with that, right? I mean, that was as close as you're going to get to a violent rebellion, which occurred, okay? So that occurred. You would never think that person would become reelected as president, and that's exactly what occurred, right? So that's an amazing thing. I mean, it was an attack that he was, there, that occurred. Of course, when he becomes president, then he lets them off the hook, so there's no legal implications for those. So it basically okayed it. That's one. Two, we have 100% plus tariffs. Interesting, right? Particularly for a Republican president. And apparently increased government intervention is back in vogue. So take those three things, the lack of law, tariffs, and government intervention. All go against the neoliberal menu of ideas, which is all popular now. It's enthusiastically embraced by those on the right. So, wow, what is happening here? So, what does this mean? So, to me, this is such an amazing moment of just things that just completely flipped so quickly, right? So quickly. My Republican friends and colleagues, and they just changed they don't seem to see the contradiction that emerged, right? They're all in favor of tariffs now. They're all in favor of government intervention. They're all in favor of, chaos and these sorts of things, the rules of law. So what does this mean? Is this a moment? Is this a revolutionary moment that is occurring? In some sense, it is. Because what it tells me, anyway, is that fundamental change is of ideas and ideology is very easy. Shockingly easy. Right? So he changed that whole narrative in 3 months, and it was, No problem at all. People didn't realize the contradiction and they went on their ways or weren't concerned with the contradiction and all of that stuff. An amazing moment. Amazing moment for people that are interested in revolution. So you can see revolution can occur. Second part of this, though, is that what type of revolution kind of was it? Right? What was this sort of thing? Not so impressive of a revolution, at least in terms of its goals, right? What did we change? Oh, okay, so we talked about the tariffs, the government intervention, right? We have fear of immigrants, right? That's where this sort of revolution led. Fear of trade, fear of elections, all of these sorts of things, right? So it was a revolution, to be sure. And I don't think we can shortchange that. But it was a revolution towards a set of goals that one would not, on the left, necessarily want to support. So what does it make sense to support? What that revolution was not was a critique of capitalism. That's not what that was. Okay? So Donald Trump is not critiquing capitalism, no matter what he's saying about tariffs and the free market and that sort of stuff. This is also not a class war, right? Now, there are implications, there are cultural aspects, right, that overlap. Culture and economics and those things are not reducible to each other, and some of these things overlap are important, right? And there are class implications to what Trump is doing. But this is not a class war. This is not the empowerment of the proletariat for reasons that, you know, the evisceration of the middle class is now in full swing, right, under the banner of helping many of these people, which is the way that, you know, many of these things occur, right? This is contradiction, this is irony, this is all sorts of those things that occur, right? So in order to then understand, okay, how can we make this different? What should be a Marxist reaction to Trump? And I'm talking about a Marxist reaction to Trump, not a democratic reaction to Trump, right? One of the worst things the left, I think they can do, is align themselves with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has been completely involved and participated in all of this, in the notion that they are a countervailing force, I think is nonsense. They're a different thing, but a difference, you know, without a distinction, or a distinction without a difference, however that goes, they're not going to help in any manner, shape, or form in this. Is it a little bit different? Sure, but it's not going to get us to where we want to be. So what we want to do is look at the class implications. And the only way to look at the class implications of this is to have a class consciousness, to use a Marxian analysis, to use an analysis of class, to use an analysis of surplus. Someone mentioned the labor theory of value, right? That type of thing to help us understand what is occurring here. So we have to begin to think about this in terms of a critique of capitalism. Why a critique of capitalism? Because everything that Trump and the Democrats and the Republicans are arguing is everything but capitalism, right? They're arguing about immigrants. They're arguing about how elections should be organized. They're arguing about, you know, the petty things that distract us from the larger issue. Is what we are experiencing, one could argue, is a collapse of capitalism, right? And so they don't know how to deal with this. They don't understand this in this way. So they have to find some other fall guy to place this on. And so this is what all of this debate is on, right? Furthermore, this is not about Donald Trump. This is much larger than Donald Trump, right? We created a set of conditions which gave rise to Donald Trump, which he then took advantage of, right? But this is not about Donald Trump. And don't misunderstand it. When he's no longer the president, you're still going to have the same environment that you have, right? Yes, the rhetoric is different. Yes, the tariff might be somewhat different, for sure, right? But fundamentally, the thing that is fundamentally at the heart of what is going on with the middle class, right, is about a capitalist system that can no longer support them, right? Now, it's not put in those class terms, right? It's put in cultural terms. Right? But what is happening? The amount of debt that people are taking on, the lack of you know, he's trying to erode education. But education wasn't that great before then either, right? So the lack of decent pay, the lack of secure employment, right? Not just some wage, but sort of, you know, not precarious work that many, that you are going to face. right? Where you're going to look for jobs every few years, that sort of thing, right? So this is what is fundamentally, I would argue, going on here, is this sort of demise of capitalism. Capitalism can't figure out how to work itself out of this, so now it's going to find some other things to argue about. So Trump, in that sense, becomes an escape valve. He becomes, I am the solution to your problems, whatever your problems are, right? So in that sense, Trump had to happen. He had to happen. We could not go back to a traditional Biden or a traditional Republican sort of thing. Why? Because that has failed so many times in a row. People are saying we need something else, right? So Trump plays the role of that something else without really being something else, but right, playing that role so people say, okay, this is what's going to save us, right? That's just not going to be the case, right? So this is why I think a Marxian analysis of a serious Marxian analysis of what is going on in the current conditions is the best way to, one, understand what is happening both with Trump in the United States, and two, understanding what an alternative would be. So let's talk about what that alternative would be. That alternative, the mistake I think we make is thinking about democracy, which is a great thing, but only political democracy, right? As if that suffices, right? But if you have this much democracy in the political realm and your economic realm is completely devoid of any democratic participation, right? It's a drop in the bucket of what is needed, right? So we have to begin to think about taking that notion of political empowerment and taking it to economic empowerment, right? That's a step of democracy that needs to be taken. It's not so much about elections, right? It's more about how we organize production, people taking, participating in that in some sort of conscious way, right? In some sort of empowering way. And I think that was helpful for us to go forward.
If any of the panelists want a short response to any of those opening remarks, you can do so now.
I'm just going to have quick responses,
Sure.
and then we'll go to a Q&A. Yeah, just responses to everybody's remarks, and then we'll kind of open up. So you brought up an analogy that I thought was really good about glacial ages, and not to be morbid, but I don't know, a phenotype dying out or something, and the lack of continuity. And I feel like the question that comes up with Trump, and the reason why I brought up the millennials who are now, getting to their middle age, and I'm one of them, so that's why I can say this, is that, Trump, again, didn't follow the sky, but also for the last 20 years, there had been some kind of left that recognized some necessary change was coming, at the very least since the Iraq War, right? Meaning the Republican Party, in a sense, was already in crisis with the Iraq War, meaning the libertarians in the Republican Party were like, yeah, I don't know about this. And, you brought up immigration. Well, the Tancredo side of the Republicans had a lot of issues with the war in Iraq with the neoconservatives, meaning they were like, we're not going to support, the NSA if you're not going to pass, some kind of immigration bill, because George Bush this is the younger Bush. George W. Bush was like a liberal on immigration. So I bring this up because I think, to your point, it's one of these things of changes happen in capitalism. There's the famous line from the manifesto, all that's holy is profaned, all that's solid melts to air. And when one is kind of not in the process of partaking in that change, even confusedly, this is not a question of activism or something, it's to the degree that it's the right who is taking up the change, it's Trump in this case, then it either is called fascism, because obviously the left did a lot of protests and, need I say, violent acts in the last 2 decades as well, meaning I remember the George Floyd protests. I was there. Right? There were police stations burnt down as well. That was within the memory of January 6th. And January 6th people brought that up when they would say, why is it just us that are being targeted? And I mention this because, of course, a lot of the discontents that brought Trump to power were ones that used to be millennial ones, meaning it used to be alter globalization, it used to be anti-NAFTA, it used to be Danny Roderick and Ha-Joon Chang and all sorts of, anti free trade stuff. And now I feel like I'm seeing Jacobin talk about free trade. out of nowhere, like this came out of nowhere. And, oh, don't you know Marx has a speech on free trade? And it's one of these things of like, maybe it's not a reaction. It's not about tailing Trump, obviously. Of course it's right-wing. Of course it's, going to be a reconstitution of capitalism. But I think, to Professor Brennan's point, about if this is a change, if this is really post-neoliberalism, how can we get out ahead of what's really changing? Right, so the kind of tariffs in the last, few weeks, like it's a shotgun blast, it's targeting everybody, it's going to hit the US the most, like we all know it's the automobiles and everything like that, or in multinationals and it's their supply chains. But since 2008, global trade has not been stable, right? I mean, China already moved away and was trying to say, no, we have to be self-subsistent, and obviously 2014, Ukraine-Russia also led to further fragmentation. So these things have been there, and the Democrats in a way kind of sludged through them. Like they've tried to put immigration reform, Obama was the deporter-in-chief, all of these things. And then I agree that Trump just becomes the rhetorical heavy person in this case. But it's one of these things where it's like, these changes have been coming. It used to be the case that the left partook in the changes in capitalism and tried to render it conscious so that it could overcome them, right? So that we don't just get more capitalism for our children and our grandchildren. But when we're kind of in the sidelines watching it, when there's not a left that politically exists, then it's like one of, do I like this or not, or a reaction, or is this good or bad? So I just wanted to kind of raise that. I thought the metaphor, the ecological metaphor, was useful here in terms of history. What does it mean to be historically conscious? How about that?
It's to recognize what was done in the past, why it failed, why it worked. And also, I think one issue with at least the American left is there's kind of a romanticization of the spontaneous revolution, like what you saw in Arab Spring, what you saw in the uprisings in 2020. It's interesting you mentioned that PSL did an article on it, and it focused particularly on how, because it was decentralized, it was easy to co-opt, it was easy to suppress. And basically what happened...
George Floyd.
Yes.
But yeah.
It's funny, the January protesters said, nothing happened to them. Well, something did happen to a lot of them. Like a lot of them mysteriously died, the George Floyd protesters. And the ones that remained, a lot of them kind of end up being either Democrats or just flat out charlatans. So that's one thing. What were the other questions? On the topic of immigration, I wanted to bring this up. With the rise of Trump, it signified like a change in how Americans view immigration. So compared to other developed countries, the U.S. is more open to immigrants, at least in the sense they're open to their labor. There at least was a recognition amongst the ruling class, at least, that allowing immigrants into America allowed for a cheap, expendable working class. And now you see a shift in that, and I find that really interesting. And I can't say for certain, but I think it has something to do with the upcoming climate crisis. Because even though they might not recognize climate change, they understand something's happening in the global south that's causing people to migrate here. And they're very concerned about this. Because one thing that the right wing is very concerned about is demographics. And I think that's what's currently happening. It's the creation of Fortress America. Try to build up a wall to prevent the coming the migrant hordes. And I think there's also a liberal side to that as well. Kind of like a life raft idea that, we can't solve climate change. All we can do is save what we have here. But, the other countries, they're drowning. They're gonna take them with us. So we have to prevent them coming into the life raft. I think at least that's my theory when it comes to our change in the immigration policy. Sorry, was there other aspects of the question? Yeah.
Oh, I was just asking about, there seemed to be this thing about historical consciousness. So maybe to reframe it as well, like, yes, it would be nice to give a Marxist analysis, but they're not kind of theories that one can just pick up, right? Meaning this was already an issue with the Second International, that they were trying to make sense of Marx's time at the turn of the century, Rosa Luxemburg, Edward Bernstein, and they were like, well, we can't just pick up capital and use it again. There's something about how the world has transformed. And so I was basically asking, like, well, what does it even mean to be a Marxist today? Is kind of an open question. Can one? I don't know. Like, it's like a general question.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a tough one, too. I think one thing you shouldn't do is be dogmatic and just say just because capital says it, it's law. I think it's actually studying the working class. Like, that's the great innovation that Engels had. You know, he was one of the first people to just, like, you know, follow the workers from his dad's factory and ask him, like, you know, how is life? You know, there's a huge section in Capital Volume 1 where it's just interviews of child workers and what their lives are like. I think that doesn't really happen anymore for, like, modern day Marxists. We don't study people. We don't we don't listen to the working class and understand, like, what their actual conditions are. I think that's a start. Yeah. So that's all I got.
Cool.
Yeah, we got to bring back Studs Terminal for any of those who know. Interview people, amazingly in the Chicago area. You should do those types of ethnographic research. A couple of points that I would like to comment on. Like, I like that question, what does it mean to be a Marxist? I'll tell you what it isn't. Okay? So to the extent that Marxism is about class, racism, which is a very important issue, is not about class. Environmentalism is not about class. Sexism is not about class. Now, do those things intersect and participate and, absolutely, right? So all of those things one needs to be concerned with as well. So I'm not lessening that. I'm not producing a hierarchy. However, class is something else. And to the extent that racism, environmentalism, sexism can be folded in easily into a neoliberal, pro-capitalist regime, not necessarily well, but easily can be co-opted into that sort of a thing, right? So the left, the question about, what is the left? To the extent that left is embroiled in those issues, but not having a class consciousness, right? It still misses a big part of what it needs to do to be a Marxist, which is different than racism, environmentalism, and sexism. And another sort of question, you talked about government oppression. Yes, that's there. But in some sense, we don't need to have that oppressive of a government, right? There's no oppressive government in this room. But there's also not people in this room. Why? Well, because there's an ideological aspect here, right? The ideology, right, is against all of this. So you don't need to have oppression, right? If you have an ideology that is anti-Marxist or whatever, right? Where does that ideology come from? It comes from education, right? So we have an educational system that doesn't support this stuff. So when I discuss Marxism in class, it's like, ooh, scary, spooky stuff, right? Right? The media is not discussing this, right? So when you look at the media and you listen to the news is not the news. The news is such a slight, pulling out these sort of, but they're not discussing, right, capitalism in any of this. It's the biggest story there is to tell, right? It's not discussing this. We're discussing, the Pope, and we're discussing, people going to space, and we're discussing everything but, right, the main issues that have to occur. It's literature, right? So we have an ideology in part because we actively embraced a different ideology, right? We have been easily manipulated, and it's very easy to be manipulated. We're all subject to this, right? And we don't critique the dominant systems that are in play, right? So why are we in this situation that we're in? Well, let's look at the more dominant, economic systems that put us in this place where our best hope is Donald Trump. That's the question, right? Why is Trump, for many, many people, the best option? That's the question, right? And so we have to look at the economic system and those conditions which gave rise to that occurring.
Could I respond?
Oh yeah. No,
Sure.
One thing I would like to add, thank you. So Marxism is about class, that's definitely true. I think it's also about analyzing interconnectedness of different things. That's where the dialectics comes from. And hence, to look at other historical revolutions, like from my own country, one of the issues with organizing labor in South Asia was the divide between Hindus and Muslims. So that's where something like religion or race is really important, because one of the tactics of the ruling class is to divide people amongst these different groups and have them fight each other. One phrase from PSL is that we're not outnumbered, we're out-organized. But one obstacle to organizing is these various, sexism, racism, and you got other versions of chauvinism that divide us. And if that happens, we can be picked off one group at a time. And sorry, I'm going to scatterbrain to go back to your question. What should a modern day Marxist do is create coalitions between all the various different new, especially activists, like your environmentalists, your black activists, your pro-immigration activists, try to create a coalition. Try to tell them, your main concern actually boils down to capitalism, and that regardless of what your background is, you're still a worker. And that's what you should be organizing around.
I'm going to break Myrtle and just jump in. I know we're about to we'll go to the Q&A right after this, but I'm just going to stir the pot a little bit. Okay, 20th century. Okay, so, because class was brought up. So in the New Left, the critique of Marxism was, it's about class, and there's all these other kinds of oppression. There's race, and you brought up America. And so there's an idea that Marxism is a European thing, or it's like Lenin's Russian or something, and so therefore what about, Jim Crow and the race code in the United States? Okay, so why do I bring that up? Class for Marx was not a positive category. That's the liberal view of it, right? So you read Adam Smith, he talks about the classes of workers, the classes of masters, these kinds of things. Bourgeois society, the modern society, was supposed to be classless, right? It was supposed to be basically people participate, there can be inequality, there can be things like this, but we all kind of participate, we're equal qualitatively. The return of class, that all of a sudden society seemed to fall into a class struggle, that all of a sudden history becomes a class struggle, that's a misrecognition of the crisis of capitalism, right? In other words, it's a repetition that's happening after the Industrial Revolution, where bourgeois society is becoming self-contradictory with itself. And so it looks like it's as if there's an antagonism between groups in society. So probably there are people in this classroom who have taken some political science 101 and your teacher said you had to read, Locke and Hobbes or these kinds of people and Rousseau. The general will, right? The will greater is sum than its parts. The point for Marx is that that's what's becoming self-contradictory. That society as a whole is becoming contradictory, its ends and its means. And it's looking like it's a regression to pre-bourgeois society. So this is why the workers were relating to their capitalists as if they were the feudal lords, as if they were the masters, right? It's the opening sentences of the Communist Manifesto, right? Free men and slaves, these kinds of things. It's a projection. It's the way in which the workers were making sense of themselves, is that they were given a promise of freedom, And then they were finding themselves in a situation where that was undermined. And that's why the term is proletariat, as opposed to working class. There's always been a working class. People have worked, it's in the Bible, right? It's the, original sin. You bit from the apple, you have to work, okay? The proletariat, this is that people have to sell their labor and they can't get a job. But they have their rights, they have their political rights. And so you brought up Donald Trump. Who is he appealing to? People in the Rust Belt. They can't get a job, but they have their vote. Citizen rights, but without property. They can't realize themselves in civil society. And so the class struggle was an expression of crisis. It was a negative category. It wasn't a sociological category, right? Like, no doubt, yes, you mentioned Engels walking out of his dad's factory, walking through the East End in England. But he's saying, how is this different than all of the poverty and pauperism that all of humanity has known, that the church took care of, right? The meek shall inherit the earth, the poor, it's in the Bible, it's in these things. What's new about this? What Engels is encountering is he's encountering a working class that has organized itself in a political party. That had never been done in history. It was weird. It's like odd, it's the Chartists. So coming back to this question about class, it's not about like, okay, who's educated, who's the working class? Okay, if you're educated, you're a professional managerial class. If you're not, are you wage labor, are you small business? It's like I used to see people do this with the Freedom Convoy, right, if you remember, out of Canada. No, it was a question of like politics, right? I mean, the people who made up the socialist parties, Lenin, when he was arrested and they asked about his background, he said, I'm an aristocrat. That ain't working class, right? And yet he's representing the proletariat as a whole. So I guess going back to this point about like the original thing of like, I agree that we should be very open to things about, what does the working class even have to teach us? But that's why also coming back to this question of Marxism, it's like maybe one has to, I don't know how to put it, like re-earn, right? Marxism was the critique of socialism, it was the critique of the proletarian movement. And at the moment we have like all of these theories from the 20th century. It's like surplus value, and I can throw things at different phenomena that happen. But in a sense, it's all the bones of the 20th century that I'm like kind of throwing on things. And there's potentially a productive moment there. Like if you realize how you're receiving socialism and Marxism, you can think about why this is the case and why we receive it like this. But otherwise, it's like, I don't think the terms class are like ready-made, just immediate things. Are people oppressed? Do their bosses exploit them? Of course, but that's always existed. Whereas class was something different. But I'll just add that. Maybe we can
Alright, we're going to open up the panel to a Q&A for anybody who wants to ask questions to the panelists. You can do so right now. Anyone at all.
So I wanted to know if I wanted to know if any of you guys noticed similarities between what's happening right now with the looting of our country underneath the Trump administration and what happened in the 1990s with the looting of the Soviet Union while it was collapsing. Do you notice any similarities between the two?
Yeah, the similarity is there is a state that's in decline, and there are capitalists who see that decline and want to take what value there is, what assets, and for their own. So yeah, there are similarities. Using, from my perspective, when the Soviet Union collapsed, basically, the U.S. and oligarchs came in kind of for parts. And essentially, that's kind of what's happening in the U.S.
So I guess the question is like, is this like the fall of the Soviet Union, the ruble's going to zero? Kind of quick no.
Essentially, yeah.
So when you were saying that, I was thinking that like Trump's campaign slogan, famously or infamously, is "Make America Great Again," and this is like an allusion to Ronald Reagan. And so I say this because I feel like, there's this old kind of, it's a letter from LaSalle to Marx. Since Marx is already here, we might as well mention his frenemy LaSalle, who says, something like, Hegel used to say in his old ages that when there was about to be a change, an epoch would gather up all of its most simple elements into kind of purified form before changing. And I say this because, I feel like the kind of memories that are coming back from the kind of early neoliberal period, right? So you just made a reference to, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is maybe, the decade into neoliberalism, but also it's the beginning of the so-called Unipolar Moment. It's like the Sam Huntington moment. And Trump alluding to Ronald Reagan, even though in a sense he does the exact opposite, right? This is what you were saying in your comments. It's like he's getting the Republican Party to do the exact opposite of what they've said they've done. That my point is that maybe the transformations in capitalism, they look like a return to very simple moments. And all that I'm trying to raise today is kind of being cognizant. I'm not saying I'm I can see into the future or something. I'm just trying to take things with a caveat from the 20th century. That capitalism's changed a lot, and it's changed through people's discontents, right? So I think Professor, you alluded to this, which is that, in the 60s, in a sense, there was more unionization, there was a stronger working class, there was more of a shift towards labor in some sense. It was coming out of the 30s. And maybe it might be your grandparents now, I guess it's my parents, it's like the boomers, they rebelled against it, right? Because it was a kind of leave it to beaver society. They called it racist and imperialist, and it was sexist and all of these things like that. And it was, right? Jim Crow was a New Deal coalition thing. And I bring this up because, again, it's exactly when there seems to be this total crisis under the world, things like that, I'm just trying to give the caveat of, I don't think this is the terminal point. I think this is the world that we all know. It seems like what capitalism is. In a sense, people have just identified neoliberalism with capitalism, such that if neoliberalism goes away, it means the apocalypse. It doesn't mean anything else. And so, yeah, I don't know, Trump can totally destroy the economy and everything this year, and yet that could be the resource for a new boom. And that's actually a Marxist point, right? That the destruction actually sets up the new boom. That capitalism moves through its destruction, right? Doge, whatever, terrorists destroyed everything like that, but past changes in capitalism have been cataclysmic. I mean, there are wars that are happening, they're also part of it. They're just on the periphery. It's not World War I, which was a change in capitalism. So I don't know if you wanted to respond or anybody else wanted to respond.
I have nothing else to say, so.
Okay.
I just want to say one thing.
I think it's on.
Do you see that in previous kind of events, there's at least an accumulation of capital? There's, more factories, more industrial agriculture. Is that still the case right now, or do you see a decline as things are being destroyed?
Are there more factories in the world?
Capital in general. If things are continuing as they are now, as each crisis happens, do you see capital increasing, more factories, more industrial agriculture, or will we see a decline?
So, I would say capital's not a thing, right? It's a contradiction. It's a contradiction of our social relations. And so, in a sense, capital doesn't have to be factories. These are forms of appearance that can also take the form of, I don't know, how does Shine work? It doesn't even work through factories. It's a whole logistical chain. Things could be automated. They could be digitized, all sorts of things like that. So it's not like I'm saying, oh, there's going to be a change, now we're going to be in Narnia and everything's going to be good for the working class. It's just going to be a different kind of exploitation. And so yeah, I guess maybe something you're alluding to is, I guess people think it's like Donald Trump is like, we're going to have factories back on, I don't know, America or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen. I think it is going to be something similar to the 90s. This is total speculation on my part, so I'm not like, you can hold me to it, it's fine. That it would be like a skill bias change again, and it would be people get exploited in a different way. And, you know, we're not just talking about America, we're talking about China, we're talking about Europe. You know, I mean, Germany breaking the balanced budget. China has needed to change for a while since Hu Jintao, right? Like they have changed. We need national champions. We can't just be export dependent. Parts of the world, India and Brazil, have needed to change. And, you know, it can take the form of like a unilateral madman. Who am I talking about? But that could be something 50 years from now. It's like, you know, Richard Nixon was considered a madman. And there was a Nixon shock. And there was a lot of catastrophe, and there was a bad time, and there was inflation and stagflation in the 70s, and yet there ended up being another boom in capitalism. It doesn't mean that everything became good, it just changed how it was. And so I just know that when things get destroyed, it's not like, you know, what is it, the first law of thermodynamics? Capitalism's kind of like that. When it destroys it, it's just liquidating it to change it in another way. So coming back to the point about class and what we've been talking about, you know, what's missing would be a movement that could have made that change self-conscious in some way. So it's total speculation on my part about what it might look like or something. I'm like betting on the stock market, something.
Unless we're doing
Yeah.
others.
There you go.
You know, sometimes I just want to make sure the students go somewhere. Can you hear me without this? I'm gonna.
Yeah.
But I have a lot of thoughts, so I wish I could write them down before I'm actually organize them. I guess first an observation on the contradiction within the Republican Party or the shift of the Republican Party. Yes, tariffs, complete shift. The rating of whatever welfare state the U.S. managed to build, the zeal of deregulation, this has been the wet dream, of the Heritage Foundation, et cetera, for a long time, and Social Security, et cetera. And the reason they couldn't do it beforehand is because they were, for the most part, looking at what were understood to be legal constraints. And the grand new idea of Trump and company is, wow, we have control of the executive branch. We can do what we like. We have power. And we will shape opinion with this power. So these are already many thoughts. One of them was even the question of the contradiction within the Republican Party is complicated because some of the Reagan era aspiration, if I can call it that, is being instituted in a big way now, which is why so much of the capitalist class didn't support Trump initially, and they thought, oh well, you know, the markets will discipline him on tariffs because he doesn't want to wreck the market. Well, they may have been wrong on that question. I guess that's I suppose an observation. One other question that comes up to mind for me about the question of what does it mean to be a Marxist, or perhaps what does Marxism mean? It's hard to think of that question in this context without thinking of the way that Trump and his people have deployed the word Marxism, if you have noticed, over the past X number of years. He'll call judges that rule, no, you cannot grab somebody and just ship them off to a gulag in El Salvador. You can't just grab somebody and put them there indefinitely without putting them on trial. We thought that was unarguable. These judges aren't Marxists, but he and Stephen Miller were called Marxists. So that's what Marxism means now, whatever they don't like. So do with that what you will, I don't know. It's interesting to me because this raises the question of the relationship between Marxism and liberal democracy, which is a really thorny question. Because I think there are some valuable things about liberal democracy which perhaps we can build on in to take Professor Brennan's point, in rebuilding class consciousness, putting aside for a second the meaning of the word class, which you raised, but in rebuilding class consciousness. The big question, so those are a lot of observations, I suppose. The big question for me, I suppose, now is, in a very large sense, the relationship between, for lack of a better terms, culture and economics. I've been hearing a battle like this, or arguments like this, since at least 2016, certainly beforehand, but definitely in 2016. You know, what shifted the election? Was it economics? Was it racism? And people would point to the class position of the voters, and they point to the class positions of the rioters in January 6th, and now it was actually the petty bourgeoisie who was doing it. And I don't know, Professor Brennan, if this is the position that you're taking or not, but sometimes I hear the position that, well, if we can have a class consciousness, then the xenophobia that has led to this degree of state violence, like the gleeful parading of state violence. You can point to all kinds of other state violence, but here it's like on display, yay, come get us, right? Yes, we're gonna throw them in a gulag, woohoo. But the xenophobia that has led to this, I'm still deeply horrified by it. That we can address this with class consciousness. Maybe, I mean, I'm seeing glimmers of that. Like, there was I don't know what trade union it is, but Abril Garcia, the Salvadoran, there's this one case of that, right? So there's a separate case about the class of Venezuelans that we've been shipping off. But then there's a one case about, I think his name is Abril Garcia, and I don't know what union is a part of, but that union is saying, bring him home, he's our brother. Now, to your point, to be careful about falling into romanticization of revolution or what have you, but like, is there an opening there? Maybe. I don't know. I suppose I've become, in the last few years, more cynical than I've ever been before, because I'm seeing so much, I mean, it depends on where you look, of course, but like, so much rage and disdain for the foreigner. And there is a question for me as to like how much this is about people's sort of general feelings of scarcity and precarity. You know, this goes way back, of course, right? Somebody else is taking. One way or another, there's an invading force that's taking. You know, and if we can overcome this like nonsense of scarcity, we're one of the richest countries in the world, it's preposterous. If we can overcome this nonsense, then maybe we don't have to feel this way. Maybe there could be international, like we're talking about Marxism here, what about internationalism, right? Like what about international solidarity? It seems to me like one way into this question about immigration and like deep xenophobia. I don't know, though. It doesn't mean that like we shouldn't try. And it's certainly true the Democrats in particular have abandoned class politics, and therefore I agree that the way in which issues of racism and sexism are looked at very often wind up playing into neoliberalism that need to. But I don't know how to get through this. And when I look at the sort of Trump phenomenon, I see, and you know, I'm sure good Marxists don't want to reduce this to psychology, but like, I see in Trump like this just absolute, like the rest of the world be damned. The rest of the world's out to get us. You know, that's why you could have a combination of, you know, tariffs, xenophobia, and a deregulated internal economy, because it's America versus the rest of the world, and the rest of the world also has an internal enemy. And I don't know, what I had traditionally thought of as a kind of Marxism anyway, a kind of internationalist solidarity perspective, can that transcend that? I don't know. It would be really nice, but like the latest polls that I saw, you know, Trump does poorly on the economy right now, not surprising, but he's still, I think, polling over 50% on immigration. Like, and I'm seeing news reports, I think, nearly everywhere of these extra-legal renditions, and he's polling over 50% on immigration. So am I supposed, like, here I am, my voice sounds shocked, right? I am shocked. I guess I shouldn't be. But it's like, where is that how it's just gonna be? Like, there's just not gonna be any objection to this degree of celebration of state violence against foreigners? If that's where we are, it's hard for me to have hope, but if other people do, that would be awesome. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, a lot of great points. I'll just say two things. I think, obviously, going to some sort of outside the United States to find the enemy is easy, right? Because you don't have to do an internal critique then, right? So, and so in that sense, we can't be that surprised that that's, the strategy to what's going on. But what is the question I have about all of this is, to what extent are the policies actually anti-immigrant? In the sense that clearly what's the rhetoric and what's, we have these cases of, people being sent, right? But my guess is those borders are pretty open and lots of people are coming, and my guess is the Trump and Republicans know that, right? And they're not, so the crackdown is not effectively that. So in some sense they get their cake and eat it too, right? We can still get the cheap labor that comes in that's exploitable. So that doesn't really, that keeps capitalists happy. And on the other hand, the worker in the in the middle of the country, then feels that somehow they're being protected by this. So that's just one of the, actual questions I have about the immigration policy.
When it comes to how people seem to be okay with Trump's immigration policy, I think it's because there's been a concerted effort to dehumanize immigrants, and also I think it's important to bring up dehumanize Arabs and Muslims. It's easy to just call anyone you don't like a terrorist, pro-Hamas supporter, and it makes it easy for people to be okay with their rights being completely stripped away. So I think that's been something that's been in the works for a few years. And one thing that you brought up is like people's ideology just change rapidly, so there's hope. And that can be changed. That's pretty much all I'd say.
So, okay, so you mentioned internationalism and also liberal democracy. In a sense, every single demand that comes from the working class is liberal. I'm not saying that as a dismissive, meaning that's the only terrain that they have. It's their bourgeois right? Meaning your bodily right, your right to free speech, your right to vote, your right to association, which is what a union is, your right to a due process, all of these things that we've seen subject to permanent residents who have just been put on a plane or arrested, right? So I was in New York and I was talking about, I might mispronounce his name, Mahmoud Khalil? Right, okay, so here's an example of a contradiction right here. Okay, so the Constitution of the United States, who does that appeal to? That's everybody in the world, right? That's civil right. Okay, so your right to free speech. And so on the one hand, that's a direct violation of his civil rights. His rights as a laborer, actually, right? His rights to associate, his rights to speak. On the other hand, the nation state presupposes citizens. It presupposes people who are subject to laws and stuff like that, meaning I can go to other countries, my body is protected, my property is protected, I'm not allowed to vote in another country, like in Denmark, China, something like that. I don't participate in their politics in that case. And so, of course, what is Marco Rubio appealing to? It's not that I like this, I'm just saying what is the validity of what they're trying to say. They're appealing to, well, if we've given you this status, then you've agreed to the very fine print, right, that nobody reads or something, and it's all subject to courts and everything like that. And obviously courts have said, no, this is a violation, of course. And so, of course, I'm glad to hear that unions representing labor are saying, oh, we want to protect our king, right? I'm saying that in the universal brotherhood and sisterhood and of labor, that we protect the rights of other laborers. But I also know where the validity of their discretion comes from, the states. And this is why the state, speaking of Marxism, is an expression of the crisis of society. Because it's not that there's internationalism, it's that bourgeois society just was cosmopolitan from its birth. Just labor was. This is why we have civil society. And so the existence of states is the scandal of bourgeois society that we have. I don't know how many states in the world, 187 or something like that. It means people still have to appeal to the powers of coercion to change something about civil society, which was supposed to be free, right? What's the last line of the manifesto? The free association of laborers? That's like pure Adam Smith. Like, this is just standard bourgeois society. So I say this because I'm like, I agree that in a sense, any defense, any rebuilding of a workers' movement in the US is going to be based on liberal rights. And classically, it has been the case. The SPD in Germany defeated Bismarck on the basis of liberalism, appealed to just the rights of society. And so I think that should be the case that's appealed to. One other thing I wanted to say about like the us versus them kind of thing like that, they would put it as globalism, right? This is the phrase?
Right.
Okay, so I'll use a little Hegelianism, not that I'm trying to avoid your question. Kernel of truth. Right? Meaning, what does capital look like to people? It looks like the invasion of our sovereignty. And sometimes we're used to it more in quote-unquote leftist sense. Right? What was a popular phrase in the 20th century? Neo-colonialism. Right? Or the IMF or the World Bank, they're neo-colonial. Right? In other words, they're infringing upon the sovereignty of different nations through loans or something like that. So obviously, like, Trump appeals to the same kind of thing, and it rings to people in a certain way. It's something that would have to be worked through. Like, you don't appeal to it and just go, yes, it's true, the anonymous bankers are killing everybody. Like, obviously, this is demagoguery. But, this also even goes to the racism question, which is that racism used to be understood in the socialist movement as a challenge, as opposed to the problem. Meaning, capitalism makes people antisocial. It's not like from birth you decide somebody who has a different skin color than me is another something. That was not the case. Right? It comes out of the antisocial character of capitalism that people go, oh, I guess there's something different. Yeah. I mean, I used to live in Houston, Texas, right, speaking of immigration, and I would meet people who are non-white who would say, yeah, kick all the illegal immigrants out. Right? Like, they would say the things that we would associate with the nativists and with the Trump people, and it was not people that looked like me, it was not white people. And I'm not saying this to be like, therefore it's right, I'm trying to say, like, capitalism is truly antisocial. And I think to your point, it would be, it's kind of like, what does it mean to actually work beyond that? And not to just the capitalist politicians can just capitulate to it. They can be like, yeah, you're right. Right? And maybe the last thing I'll just say is that immigration reform has just been like sitting in the background in the US since the 90s, and they tried it again and again, right? It was like the Sensenbrenner bill, and then it was like McCain and Kennedy, and then Obama tried it, and then Trump tried it. And in my opinion, what are they gonna do when I don't like this? They're gonna try to institute some kind of guest worker thing, and we're gonna get like a 3-tiered system, where it's going to be like unionized, ununionized, and then people, this was already there at the beginning of the Trump administration, of you're going to be subject to like a work program. And that itself is like, stripping people of rights, because it's like, yeah, you can work at this business or we send you back to wherever. So of course, even it's like, I don't know, it's reforms in capitalism. And I'm not trying to say it as in it's good, I'm trying to just be sober about it. Go ahead.
Capitalism? You say
Reforms in capitalism, yeah. Because I think this is to your point earlier, that it's like, when I was in Houston in 2016, I remember saying, there's an immigration crisis in the US, and someone said, well, there's no crisis, and what they meant was that we can feed everybody in the world. The United States can feed everybody in the world. Of course we can. Of course we can. So why is there a crisis? Well, it's a crisis in how we do things. It's not like a physical limit, right? Meaning, politically, immigration has become football, right? Because the Democrats also played this game, right? They did. They did sanctuary cities, and then they set up people to become the targets of demagoguery. I mean, I'll give one more story, and then I'll shut up and we'll go back to the Q&A. I went to Milwaukee over the summer. This is where the RNC was. And so I was talking to people. And they didn't bring up jobs. They would be like, well, what's happening is we have veterans who are homeless, and then they would make reference to like, I don't even know if this is true, but in New York City, like, that they put undocumented immigrants in like a hotel. It was
That's a big talking point.
a talking point, right? Okay.
There is FEMA money because if immigrants,
Right.
if they're waiting on their asylum case,
Right.
they're petitioning for asylum, but they're not getting permission to work, so they can't produce or make an income, and they're taking.
I'm not saying this is good. I'm not saying they're at the Four Seasons or something. You know what I mean? I'm saying, like, obviously what ends up happening is this makes an object of people. And so then how does this get politicized? They go, well, our government cares not about American citizens, and they let our citizens die of fentanyl. Right? So I'm not saying this as in, like, what is Marxism? Marxism is the critique of reality, of the ideology of the working class. For ideology to be ideology, it needs to have a purchase. It needs to have like some kind of kernel of truth, right? That doesn't make it like, yes, it's true, people are inferior. Like it's not a capitulation. It means, why do people understand the world like this? Why do they feel like my government doesn't represent me and is somehow representing anonymous interests? And by the way, that used to be a liberal discontent. Isn't that there in the Declaration of Independence? From time to time, the people has to replace its, leader, blah, blah, blah. Meaning, the reason these people appealed to Washington and Jefferson, I remember seeing the Tea Party, they're like walking around dressed up like Washington. There's something to that. But I found that the left then went, oh, they're a bunch of racists. And I'm like, well, now you're just giving them over to the Republicans. Right? If you're just like, yeah, you're a bunch of racists, then what, to your point, what do they say back to you? Oh, you guys are a bunch of Marxists. And then it's just done. And then it's just in the Democrats and Republicans. And this was like 15 years ago that happened. So.
Yeah, all right. Thank
Cool.
you, everyone.
Cool.
That's the panel. Thanks for coming.